Hi. In this video, I'm going to be talking about the conventions of theater during Shakespeare's lifetime and Shakespeare's own theater, the Globe. If you're already familiar with some of this information, great, good for you. But I guarantee you that even if you've taken a Shakespeare class in the past and Shakespeare is a passion for you, that I think you're going to learn some new things. Theater in Shakespeare's day was very different from theater in our own day. And in addition, theater went through one really big transition while Shakespeare was writing. And that is, when Shakespeare was young, the predominant kind of theater was something called a miracle play. And then by the time Shakespeare was working as an actor, there was a new type of theater happening that was much more realistic and very different from these miracle plays in some key ways. So we're going to start in Shakespeare's childhood when he was 5 years old, when he may have attended his first play. We know this because Shakespeare's father, as I mentioned in an earlier lecture, was essentially the mayor of his town, the mayor of Stratford. He wasn't called mayor, he was a bailiff and something called an alderman, but essentially it's the same thing. When Shakespeare was a little boy, there were no theaters in London. There wasn't much in the way of theaters anywhere in Britain. Actors, if they hadn't been invited to court to play before a nobleman, which was only the very lucky ones, traveled the countryside performing usually in inn yards on makeshift stages in front of whoever would come out and was willing to pay. The result is that actors were considered to be sort of equivalent to how we might think of carnival folks today, rather than the prestigious profession that acting has become in the modern day. When Shakespeare was 5 years old, we know that two theater companies visited Stratford, and because Shakespeare's father was essentially the mayor, they had to begin by presenting themselves to the mayor and requesting permission to put on a play. And in both of these cases, we know that John Shakespeare gave permission. We have his mark on a sheet of paper indicating essentially a temporary license for these actors to perform. And we know that it was completely normal for people to take children to these shows. And the first play that was put on in a situation like this was always called the mayor's play, even though the person wasn't necessarily called the mayor. And it was free to the community. And then there would be another performance for which you had to pay. And this first performance was all about honoring the mayor, building his reputation. In exchange for doing a show for money, we do one for you for free that just makes people like you and keeps everybody on board with you being in charge. So we know that Shakespeare's father would have gone to this play. He probably would have had young Will with him. We have other accounts of people from the same time period having their 5-year-old son between their knees during the show. And the actors would have all come in and paid sort of special honor to Shakespeare's dad and treated him like he was very important indeed. And so it was probably Shakespeare's first experience of theater. We can't be absolutely sure, but even if he wasn't there on that particular day, it seems reasonable to suppose that other theater companies visited Stratford and he would have seen other miracle plays. Now, miracle plays are different from the kind of theater that you are familiar with. For one thing, they're not realistic at all, not even a little bit. Not that Shakespeare's theater is realistic, but it's unrealistic in a different way. Miracle plays usually feature a protagonist who has a name that's an abstract concept. So we might imagine a protagonist named Youth who travels to a big city. And in this big city, he might encounter other characters named things like Temptation and Vice, who lead this youth down a path towards bad moral behavior. And then at the last minute, a character named Temperance or Prayerfulness will show up and talk the youth out of making bad choices. Because of their overt moral content, these plays were able to get by Puritan censors who were particularly worried about people seeing bawdy or violent acts on stage and then being tempted to recreate them at home. So these plays often, despite the plot I just described, were filled with, dirty jokes and goofy comedy that was essentially being Trojan horsed to the audience by the means of this moral storytelling device. By the time Shakespeare was in his teens, though, these miracle plays were already going out of fashion. It was a new kind of play coming in that was a bit more realistic, and that's the tradition that Shakespeare was working in. So one sort of exposure to theater Shakespeare would have had as a child would be those miracle plays. And we definitely see the fingerprints of those miracle plays on Shakespeare's work. One of the Richard plays features a character who's just named Rumor, who is the abstract concept rumors, right? And you can definitely see where that comes from. There are other elements too, and goofy, over the top exaggeration, especially in the comedies. But the other type of theater that Shakespeare would have been familiar with is the type of theater he would have read essentially at King's Grammar School. He would have read Latin plays and performed Latin plays with his classmates. We know that much of the curriculum at King's consisted just of performing these classical shows, which featured treachery and complex plots involving romance and bad destiny and betrayal, which all will sound quite familiar if you're at all familiar with Shakespeare. And in addition, some of these classical sources made use of a verse form called iambic pentameter, which finds its way into English from classical works like the Aeneid. And you may know that Shakespeare wrote an iambic pentameter, but he didn't create it, right? Iambic pentameter is that pleasing rhythm that sounds like the human heartbeat, right? Two households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona, where we lay our scene. Iambic simply refers to which syllable is stressed, and pentameter is the number of poetic feet in every line, right? A poetic foot is 2 syllables of poetry, and iamb is a foot of poetry with a stress on a second syllable. So iambic pentameter is poetry consisting of 10-syllable long lines with a stress on every second syllable. So that comes into Shakespeare from classical works. If you don't understand the concept of stressed syllables, think about the difference between the way English people and Americans talk about those 2 days that we all look forward to after the working week. In America, we call it the weekend. The stress is on the first syllable. And in England, they call it the weekend. Stress is on the second syllable. So you generally need to hear a word pronounced to know where the stress is going to be. But if you're trying to work it out, sometimes you can ask yourself, forward, is that first or second? Well, what would it be like if the stress was on the first syllable? Do we say forward or do we say forward, right? It's different. Anyway, so Shakespeare's verse form, his complex plots involving nuance and betrayal and, high-minded protagonists, but also some of his goofiness and his use of weird abstract concepts and his bawdiness probably has its roots both in these miracle plays and also the classical works that he would have read as a child. Now, when Shakespeare was about 13 years old, the first theater was built in London. It was built just outside the city walls. When you've only got one, it's easy to name it. It was called the Theater. And it was built by a man named Burbage. He was responding to a new piece of legislation passed in 1574 requiring any place where plays were performed to be specially licensed. This was a way for the Puritans to try to clamp down on theater. They were long opponents of theater. And this first theater was probably an awful lot like the inn yards where plays had been previously performed. It was a simple affair with 3 walls, more or less open to the air. By the time Shakespeare is building his own theater in 1599, things have gotten a bit more sophisticated. Almost everything we know about the Globe comes from sketches of the Globe and stage directions. We're particularly lucky that a German visitor to England who saw a show at the Globe made a sketch of the theater in his diary and in a letter that he sent with even precise dimensions of things. He was fascinated by it. He walked around the building after the fact because the original Globe burned down at a performance of one of the Henry plays towards the end of Shakespeare's life. So if you've been to the Globe in London, you're not actually visiting Shakespeare's theater. What you're visiting today is a very, very faithful reconstruction of a building that is more or less, we think, pretty identical to the one where Shakespeare's plays were performed. Now, the theater that Shakespeare's plays were performed in, the Globe Theater, was a pretty simple affair by modern standards. It was essentially a semicircle with a stage in the center that was elevated. On the stage, there were 2 pillars, and on either side of those pillars, there are doors. And above the stage, which was only 43 feet across, was a smaller balcony stage called the upper stage, right? So that's what we're looking at. There's 43 feet of space plus this balcony stage for the actors to perform. The people who are attending the theater are either standing around the stage on the ground or they're seated in what are called the gallery seats in the round around the stage. There are multiple levels of them around the stage, and those seats were more expensive, and there were also more of them. There are 1,500 seats in the galleries and about 800 room for people worth of room for people who are standing in front of the stage. Now, there's a common misconception that because the people who stood in front of the stage were called groundlings, that they were some kind of incredibly poor peasants. And in Shakespeare's day, everybody was very enlightened, and even the very poor went to the theater, and Shakespeare's plays were for everybody. And that is untrue. Modern scholarship suggests that the groundlings weren't poor peasants at all. They were university students and probably the craftsmen, younger craftsmen who were learning to be full craftsmen apprentices who didn't have a lot of money. But these are not very poor people. These are young people who will probably be prosperous later, whereas the people sitting in the gallery are mostly wealthy merchants. The really wealthy people, if you're titled or a member of the nobility or you've got a lot of money, you don't go to the theater, you bring it to you. And I mentioned that in an earlier lecture. So going to the theater is a very middle class or even lower middle class event thing that you would do. It was only a penny to get in, but it was a penny to get across the river to get there, a penny to get home, and a penny for something to eat. We actually know what the favored snack food was of theater goers in Shakespeare's day. It was walnuts, because the site of the globe has been excavated, and there are many feet of walnut shells. The theater goers apparently ate walnuts, threw the shells on the ground, and then kept watching the show, and nobody ever cleaned them up. So if you want to have a really historically accurate Shakespeare experience while you're reading Hamlet, you yourself can eat some Mariani's shelled walnuts, Mariani's walnuts, when you need both a snack and a trip back in history. Anyway, the stage itself was very Spartan. There were no elaborate sets. The set of any high school play would be far more elaborate than the sets that existed in Shakespeare's day. What you had going for you in Shakespeare's day was essentially those two pillars, and maybe someone would bring a tree or something out onto the stage. The costumes the actors wore, however, were gaudy and elaborate. They were larger than life. The robes of the nobility were brightly colored. The peasants were filthy. It wasn't real, it was hyper real. In the same way that people don't actually speak in blank verse or iambic pentameter, people don't actually dress the way actors did on Shakespearean stages. The visual experience of the plays was loud. And it's for this reason that Baz Luhrmann, the filmmaker who made that version of Romeo and Juliet with the cars and the guns, chose to do a production with bright colors, punk music, and everything is very exaggerated. Luhrmann would argue that his production of Romeo and Juliet is actually much closer to a Shakespearean show than, say, Zeffirelli's production, which was actually filmed in Verona in totally period costumes, because Shakespeare's plays weren't realistic. Okay, I'm looking at the time here, and I'm seeing that I'm almost to 14 minutes. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to break this video into two. I'm going to wrap up talking about, let's see, the stage, the seating, the walnuts, today's reconstruction, and the costumes. And I'm going to pick up in just a moment. Just go to the materials section and click on the link talking about Shakespearean special effects and how the circumstances of the stage that I just explained were realized with special effects. And the second video will be very short indeed. See you in a moment.